Hello, everyone, and welcome to our last class ever. So, funny story, I actually just finished recording this exact same lesson and realized it wasn't actually recording. So, this is my second time through, and hopefully, at least fingers crossed, it is actually recording this time, and I'll be able to upload it after this. Thank you guys for being so patient with this lesson. I'm sure you missed this class more than you've ever missed anything in your life. But honestly, on a more serious note, I have really enjoyed teaching this class, and I hope that you guys have learned quite a bit. But we're not quite done yet. We have one more class, which is today. And then after this, we will be saying sayonara to each other, at least until next semester, when we hopefully will learn more with each other. So, first of all, I want to talk a little bit about words in context. So we've done quite a bit of work with words in context before, and how that's an excellent way to learn more vocabulary. But I want to talk about it just a little bit more so that hopefully I can leave you guys with a challenge. I can leave you guys with the idea that you can go forth and empower yourselves to learn more vocabulary without ever opening a quote-unquote vocabulary book. And the way to do that is through reading. Not just reading things that are fun and entertaining, although that's fine too, but reading things that challenge your mind, something like this. So this is the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. Now, Kant was a philosopher who lived back in the 1700s, and he was someone who came up with something called the categorical imperative. So before you freak out about what does that mean? I have no idea. We're actually going to talk about what it means, and then you can see if you agree with what Kant says. Now, Kant was a proponent of basically how to decide whether something is right or wrong. So, for example, this type of philosophy is actually called something which you may or may not be familiar with. It's something called, I'm trying to find the pen here. I think this is it. So it is called axiology. So axiology. It's going to take me a while. So axiology is basically the study of what is right and wrong. And it comes from logi, which hopefully you guys will recognize as being the study of, plus axio, which has to do with decisions. So it's basically deciding what is right and wrong, what we can basically know just by looking at a situation. So there are different ways of looking at right and wrong. Some people believe that if the consequence of your action is good, in other words, if the result of what you do is a good thing, then what you do is okay to do. So I'll give you an example. If I lie to make someone feel better about themselves, and the consequence of that is that the person feels a little bit more confident that day and they're a little bit happier, then lying is okay. The other side of things says that it doesn't matter what the consequence of the action is. Right is always right and wrong is always wrong. So, for example, they would say it doesn't matter whether or not that person feels better about themselves if you lie. It is still wrong to lie to a person, to another person. It doesn't matter how good or bad the consequences are. So, Immanuel Kant was of the opinion that if it's right, it's right. If it's wrong, it's wrong. It doesn't matter what the consequence is. Actions will be right or wrong regardless. So let's read about what his philosophy was. And it basically comes down to this idea here, but we'll start up here. So he says, now all imperatives command either hypothetically or categorically. Okay, so let's talk about what those two things are. So because of the little or here, we probably know that these are going to be opposite things. Now, you probably know what the word hypothetical means, or at least you should know what hypothetical means. Hypothetical means not actual. It's something that hasn't actually happened or will not actually happen. It's a hypothetical situation. So you can probably guess that the opposite of that is categorical. Categorical is something that could actually happen or that is actually happening. In other words, real world scenarios. We're not dealing in hypotheticals. So the former, the hypothetical, represent the practical necessity of a possible action as means to something else that is willed, or at least which one might possibly will. So the former, referring to the hypothetical, represents, so the hypothetical imperatives the practical necessity of a possible action, that's where the hypothetical part comes in, as a means to something else that is willed or might possibly happen. Now, the categorical imperative, you should recognize this word from imperio, which means control. So the categorical imperative, in other words, what we should do, how we should be in control of our own lives, would be that which is represented an action as necessary of itself without reference to another end, meaning objectively necessary, if you will. So if something is objectively necessary, what that essentially means is that regardless of the subjectiveness of the situation, regardless of whether it's going to make your friend feel better if you lie to them, it is objectively speaking something which we can decide whether it's right or wrong. In other words, we don't look at any other ends. We don't look at what the action will represent. What we look at basically is objectively looking at the scenario and deciding whether what we're doing is right or wrong. And then he goes on to say, since every practical law represents a possible action as good, and on this account for a subject who is practically determinable by reason necessary, all imperatives are formula determining an action which is necessary according to the principle of a will good in some respects. If now the action is good only as a means to something else, then the imperative is hypothetical. Let's talk about this phrase just here. If the action is good only as a means to something else, then the imperative is hypothetical. I would ask you what you guys think of this, but of course you can't respond. But essentially, what this is saying is if we do an action just because we think some result is going to happen, then that's a hypothetical imperative. In other words, we don't actually know what is going to happen in the end. So I think that by lying, my friend will feel better, but do I actually know that for certain, or is that a hypothetical scenario that I've made up in my mind? Well, it's a hypothetical scenario. It's not a for sure thing that my friend is going to feel better. Maybe my friend will find out I'm lying and will feel much, much, much worse than if I had just told the truth in the beginning. So that is what Kant is calling the hypothetical imperative. Then he goes on, and by the way, this semicolon here, semicolons have the idea of contrast. If it's not contrast, then it's usually some kind of alternate idea. So if it is conceived as good in itself, and consequently as being necessary to the principle of will, which of itself conforms to reason, then it is categorical. In other words, if the action is good in itself, if it's a good thing to do. For example, not lying, telling the truth is a good thing to do. So just that is good in and of itself, and therefore it's necessary to the principle of a will, which of itself, meaning of itself, of the action itself conforms to reason, then it is categorical. Now we're going to talk about what his whole definition of the categorical imperative is. So he says, there is therefore but one categorical imperative, namely this. Now, this is what I tell my SAT students when I'm teaching them how to read critically, and I'll tell you the same thing. Anytime you see a therefore, you always want to figure out what it's there for. I know that's kind of cheesy to say that, but it really is true. You want to figure out what it's saying, because when there is a therefore, what that means is they're about to sum up everything they just said up in the paragraphs before it. So this is the categorical imperative, and I want you guys to think in your own minds whether you agree with this. Act only on that maxim, whereby thou canst at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So, what does this mean? It's giving a command. It's saying what the categorical imperative is. That you should act only on that maxim. A maxim, if you can probably guess from the context, a maxim is kind of a way to live your life, a worldview. So act only on that maxim, that you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In other words, only act in a way that you would be happy if the way that you act became a universal law for everyone. So let's look at an example. He gives a bunch of examples of what he's talking about. Here's the first one here. So a man reduced to despair by a series of misfortunes feels wearied of life, but is still so far in possession of his reason that he can ask himself whether it would not be contrary to his duty to himself to take his own life. So essentially what this is saying here is a man who's very depressed, basically, and he's wearied of life, and he is contemplating basically taking his own life. He's contemplating committing suicide. So if he follows the categorical imperative, here's what he asks himself. Now he inquires whether the maxim of his action could become a universal law of nature. So his maxim is, from self-love, I adopt it as a principle to shorten my life when its longer duration is likely to bring more evil than satisfaction. In other words, he's saying this: if I love myself, from self-love, I adopt it as a principle to shorten my life. So in other words, he's saying, I'm going to shorten my life because if it goes on any longer, it's likely to bring more evil than happiness. So it's likely to bring more bad than good. So it is then asked simply whether this principle, this maxim that he has of his own life or his own shortening of his life, if it were founded on self-love, can become a universal law of nature. Now we see at once that a system of nature of which it should be a law to destroy life by means of the very feeling whose special nature it is to impel to the improvement of life would contradict itself, and therefore it could not exist as a system of nature. Hence, and hence is kind of like therefore, it's telling you what all this means. Hence, that maxim cannot possibly exist as a universal law of nature, and consequently would be wholly inconsistent with the supreme principle of all duty. So basically, if that person asks himself, okay, is my maxim something that I would want to apply to the whole world, to everyone? And he says, no, I would not want that because it contradicts itself. So a system of nature that says we should end our lives before it is their time contradicts the very nature of humanity. Therefore, it should not be a categorical imperative, and therefore he should not kill himself. Let's look at one more here. Okay. Let me erase this a little bit. So here, another finds himself forced by necessity to borrow money. He knows that he will not be able to repay it, but sees also that nothing will be lent to him unless he promises stoutly to repay it at a definite time. So, in other words, a person, he has to borrow money, basically. And he knows that he can't repay it, but he also knows that if he says he doesn't repay it, that no one will lend him money, basically. So, as you can probably guess, he needs to make a decision. So he desires to make this promise, the promise to pay it back, but he has still so much conscience as to ask himself, and this is his maxim, is it not unlawful and inconsistent with duty to get out of a difficulty in this way? Suppose, however, that he resolves to do so, then the maxim of his action would be expressed like this: when I think myself in want of money, and want of money means in need of money, I will borrow money and promise to repay it, although I know I can never do so. Now this principle of self-love or of one's own advantage may perhaps be consistent with my whole future welfare, but the question now is it right? So this is what it comes down to. Is it right? In other words, if this were a universal law, how would it be if my maxim were a universal law? Then I see at once that it could never hold a universal law of nature, but it would necessarily contradict itself. For supposing it to be a universal law that everyone, when he thinks himself in difficulty, should be able to promise whatever he pleases, without the purpose of keeping his promise, then the promise itself would become impossible, as well as the end that one might have in view of it, since no one would consider that anything was promised to him, but would ridicule all such statements as vain pretenses. And of course, the word vain here means empty. That's what the word vain means, essentially. And so this is essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about the categorical imperative. Now, in my opinion, I think this is a fairly good way to live your life. Ask yourself, okay, this is the action I'm thinking about taking. Is this the right way? Is this right not only for me, but if this were a law or if this were a rule for humanity, would this be right also? So this reminds me of one time when I went to Disneyland as a child, and my mom saw me picking a flower off of one of the bushes. And I said, Mom, it doesn't matter. It's just this one flower that I'm picking off the bush. It's fine. And she told me something which I'll never forget. And actually, I don't think she meant this to be in line with the philosopher Immanuel Kant, but it actually was in line with the categorical imperative. She told me, well, it might not matter if you pick that one flower, but she said if every single person today who was at Disneyland walked by and picked a flower off this tree, it would be completely bare by nightfall. And I thought of that quite a bit, and I think that's a way to look at life too. Yes, it might not be a huge thing if to do something that you might not consider very wrong, or something that which you might consider harmless, basically. But if everyone did that thing, would the world be a better place? And if the answer is no, then maybe reconsider doing that thing. So let's go back to the lying analogy. So it might not be a terrible thing if you lie to your friend and tell her that, you love her outfit, even if you maybe don't. But what if everyone did that? There would be a lot less trust in the world. If anyone gave you a compliment, you would also start to distrust them and maybe think that they weren't being genuine. And would the world be a better place? Well, probably not. So this is definitely a way to look at life that I think is a very healthy way to decide what is right and what is wrong. So the axiology, if you remember back to what this means, the principle of deciding what is right and wrong. So the axiology of Immanuel Kant, if it's right for everyone, if we could make it into a law and it would make the world a better place, then you should do it. If it would make the world a worse place, then don't do it, basically. So take that what you will. I think it's a good way of living your life, and I think it's something to truly ponder for yourselves. All right, guys, let's go ahead and move on to today's lesson. So we're going to have a regular lesson today. I won't make you do any homework, of course, because this is the last lesson, but I did want to introduce you to a few new ideas here and just talk in general about finding words in context and being able to identify roots and other things like that. And then we'll also do some fun stuff with word origins as well. So the first thing I want to do is actually we're going to skip this and go straight to the reading here. And from the reading, I want you guys to mentally play along with me and see if you can figure out what these words mean based only off of the context. So ways that you can do that if you remember. So one of the ways to look at things in context is to look to see if there are any synonyms in the passage. So if there are synonyms, then there will be a word that means basically the same thing. You can also look for words that have antonyms as well. Antonyms will be a word that's the opposite, essentially. Then you can also look for words. Hang on just one second, guys. Hey, can I help you?
Yeah, we're just checking in here. Jen, I haven't talked to him.
Oh, you're checking out Dr. J? He's upstairs in room, I think in room 2.
I know where everything is. So
Oh, yeah, you're totally fine. Okay. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, so you can look at synonyms, antonyms. You can also look at the general tone of the passage. So the general tone of the passage is kind of the feeling that the author wants you to have. Sometimes there will also be examples of the thing that you're defining. And generally speaking, it'll be some combination of all of these that will help you decide. Now, sometimes there's nothing in context to help you out. In that case, of course, you would just have to use your trusty old dictionary. But a lot of times there is something there to help you out. And that's what you want to identify because you'll be able to learn a lot more words that way than you would if you're just trying to memorize a list of words, basically. So let's look at the first paragraph here. Imagine you're at a tropical beach on the other side of the world. The weather is calm and bright, palm trees are waving their fronds in the gentle breeze, seabirds are cackling, and fishermen are unloading their catches. It seems that nothing will mar this sunny, peaceful day. Okay, so if it's a sunny, peaceful day and everything around it is sunny and peaceful, then mar has to mean something along those lines. So you can probably fill this in with a different word in your mind. So you can say nothing will mess up, basically, the sunny, peaceful day. And if we look down here, it seems that nothing will basically ruin this sunny, peaceful day. And so automatically you can know what that word means. Suddenly, violent waves. Now the word suddenly means something probably came to mar it. Violent waves came out of nowhere and submerged the whole shoreline, pulverizing almost everything in their way. So if they came out of nowhere and submerge it, it definitely didn't do anything good to it. Pulverize, in this case, probably means pounding to pieces. So completely destroy, basically. Though it may seem like something from a horror movie, a scene like this can be all too real when a tsunami hits. The term tsunami is a combination of the Japanese words for harbor, su, and wave, nami. A tsunami is a series of waves often caused by powerful movements in the Earth's crust, including underwater earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. These dangerous waves can move at speeds of up to 450 miles per hour. As they approach shallow water, they become much taller. The ocean recedes from the shore. Suddenly, pugnacious walls of water slam the coast again and again until their overwhelming force is spent. So this word pugnacious, it always makes me think of pugs, and I think of two pugs fighting basically. And so the word pugnacious, as you can imagine, means strong or aggressive essentially. So pugnacious means aggressive. So strong, pugnacious, and again, this is one of those cases where a synonym helps you out. Overwhelming force would be a synonym or an example of it. On November 26, 2004, a tsunami caused by an underwater earthquake destroyed much of the coastline surrounding the Indian Ocean, killing hundreds of thousands of people and causing immeasurable destruction. The sudden impact of the tsunami obliterated entire towns. Buildings were left scattered and decomposing on the shoreline. The waves wreaked havoc indirectly, too. Because roads, railways, clinics, power sources, and communication networks were destroyed, it was impossible to get food, water, medicine, and other aid to people who urgently needed it. Sickness and malnutrition spread. The blight of the 2004 tsunami continued long after the waves hit. Okay, so let's look at a few of these here. So number 4, it obliterated entire towns. So obliterated, wiped out entire towns. Then we have decomposing here. So buildings were left scattered and decomposing, basically disintegrating on the shore. And then it says the waves wreaked havoc too. So havoc means chaos as well. And then the blight of the 2004 tsunami continued long after the waves hit. Basically, the harm of the storm basically lasted long afterward. People suffered from many diseases, not to mention grief, homelessness, and all sorts of supply shortages long after that fateful day. Our planet is not stagnant. Constant movement of the Earth's crust means that there is no way to eradicate tsunamis and other natural disasters. But since the most common causes of these potential cataclysmic waves is earthquakes, tsunamis can be predicted with some accuracy. A Pacific Ocean monitoring service centered in Hawaii sends out tsunami warnings after tremors are detected. Scientists in Hawaii actually knew about the Indian Ocean earthquake in December of 2004, but unfortunately there was no effective way to warn people in time for them to prepare for what was coming. Had warnings gotten through, many people could have escaped to higher ground, and countless lives could have been saved. Shortly after the 2004 tsunami tragedy, scientists, engineers, emergency services experts, and leaders began working on an early warning system for the Indian Ocean. It's hoped that their important work will prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. So, of course, we have stagnant, eradicate, and cataclysmic. So our planet is not stagnant. So how do we know what that word means? If you look here, it says that constant movement. So stagnant is the opposite of constant movement. So stagnant must mean still or static. Then we have constant movement of the Earth's crust, mean that there is no way to eradicate tsunamis and other disasters, basically eliminate them. But since the most common cause of these potentially cataclysmic waves is earthquakes, so cataclysmic basically means violently destructive, like the waves are. So you can kind of see how to identify the words in context. There's a lot of different ways to do it. To be honest, a lot of it just comes from practicing yourself. So it's a good habit to get into. As you're reading something, mark words which you don't know. So for example, let's say you were reading this and you weren't sure what pugnacious means. Just mark it in your book and then either figure out what it means by the context or look in a dictionary and then write it on the side. Writing something down is extremely important in helping you to remember it. That can be one of the dangers of having an online class rather than an in-person class, because you're not writing as much as you would if you were sitting in a classroom with me. And so there's always the danger of not being able to know what a what a word means because you didn't write it down and you didn't remember it, basically. Okay. So let's go ahead and move on to some fun stuff, or at least I think it's fun stuff. We're going to talk a little bit about different words and where they come from. especially focusing on etymology. So let's talk about focus and distraction. So the word distract comes from the Latin dis, which means away, plus trahere, which means to draw or to drag. When we're distracted, we are drawn away from our source or focus. That's where we get the word intractable. So basically, in means not, plus track, to draw or to drag. So it's not able to be dragged away. If you're intractable, you will not move, basically. Okay. So far, so intuitive, but focus? Well, in Latin, focus was a domestic hearth. Hearth is where where a fire in a home happens. This seems immediately appealing, with my mind instantly making connections about the hearth being the focus of the home, and the 20th century struggle between the fire and the television to be the focus in our living spaces. But this is, in some prime folk etymology, in action, because focus didn't enter English this way. It came via some good historical science. So this next word might be, or this next name might be familiar to you. Johannes Kepler used the term focus to refer to the mathematical point of convergence in an analogy with the burning point of a lens. So the fire is there after all, just not quite how we might imagine it at first. This came in handy while he was busy inventing an improvement on the telescope that allowed for a much greater degree of magnification than Galileo's original design. Thomas Hobbes borrowed this meaning and brought it into English in a mathematical context in 1656. Who knew Hobbes was into math as well as depressing political philosophy? But of course, being a good 17th century scholar, he was actually into everything. Fascinated by mathematics and optics, he was a mathematics tutor of the Prince of Wales between 1646 and 1648, and his disagreement with Robert Boyle over the validity of the experimental method forms the basis for one of the classic works within the history of science, Leviathan and the Air Pump. So in conclusion, focus is from telescopes via domestic hearths. Hobbes hated experiments but loved maths, and distraction is a frighteningly easy state to fall into. Now that we've got that sorted, we can get back to what we were meant to be doing, focus. So next one, this is one of my favorite words, and I don't know if you guys remember, this is actually where one of the first words that I ever taught you guys to do with etymology. So it's basically, let me just skip to the next page. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so supercilious, I don't know if you remember that, but super means over, of course, plus your cilium is your eyelid and eyelash. So supercilious, basically, comes directly from the Latin supercilium. Let me zoom in a little bit here. And it means arrogant. And the word comes from basically raising your eyebrow at another person. If you raise your eyebrow, you are looking down on someone. So if you are supercilious, basically, you are looking down on someone in quite a literal fashion. You're arrogant, basically. So that's where it comes from originally. Now let's talk about where the word diet comes from. So historically, dietics was concerned not only with losing weight or attaining greater health, but with maintaining health. It was also known as regime and hygiene. The important ideas were drawn from Galenic humoral theory and focused on finding foods that complemented your own personal humoral balance. Now, the humor is not like funny, haha humor. It's more the humor is meaning like the liquids in your body, basically. So if you were phlegmatic, cold and wet, then you should eat lots of melon. Incidentally, this is where the phrase agrees with me in relation to food comes from. So if you say, ooh, I don't think that food agreed with me, basically that means that it did not match your humoral constitution. And if you remember, actually, the word melon, which is something that is like a black bile in your body, this is where we get the word, and I hope you guys are saying it right now, melancholy. So melancholy, if you remember, means sadness. It's literally having too much melon, not melon as in like the cantaloupe, but melon as in like the black bile in your body. That's where they thought people who were sad. That's why they thought they were sad. The important thing in all this is the idea of order, balance, and regularity. The origin of diet is the Greek dieta or diatia, originally way of life or regimen. This gave the name to early Roman politics assemblies, dieta. Many parliaments today, including the Japanese, are still called the diet. So you'll hear things like the diet of Nantes or the diet of Worms. Those are things that are basically assemblies that they call officially the diet of blah, blah, blah. And the same notions of order, balance, and control over both the individual body and the body politic meant that the word came to define individual choices about controlling our health with food and drink. So if you look here at this diagram, we have words that you'll still recognize today. So some of these words you'll know from us, and some you might know just from your regular lives. So the first one here, phlegmat. This is where we get the word phlegmatic. Phlegmatic means basically sluggish, slow. This is also where we get the very gross word phlegm. So phlegm is that kind of mucousy material in your throat when you have a cold. It's really awful. And if you have a lot of phlegm in your body, you are pretty sluggish and slow. You don't really feel like doing anything too active. That's where that word comes from. Then we have this word up here. It looks like sanguine. It's actually sanguine. Sanguine is a word that we have today, and it basically means in good health. And it comes from the root sang, which means blood. So sanguine basically means having much blood. Now, a person who's sanguine is very optimistic. Now, why would someone who has a lot of blood be considered optimistic? Well, back in the medieval time period when they came up with a lot of these names, it was very rare to find someone who had like a nice healthy flush in their cheeks if they were not healthy, because most of the time when someone was very sick, of course, they got very pale, they lost blood in their faces, they did not look like they had good flush to their cheeks. So someone who did have a lot of flush in their cheeks could have an optimistic view of life because, of course, they were very healthy. They had blood in their cheeks. And then we have this word down here, choleric. So choleric is where we get the word cholera. And it basically means having too much choler in your body, which is kind of like a green or a yellow bile, basically. So awful, awful stuff. So choleric today just means easily annoyed or irritated. But it used to mean basically having too much bile in the body. And of course, if you've ever seen someone with cholera, which of course you haven't seen anyone with cholera because it's not really a disease that people get anymore, but people with cholera tend to be very yellowish in color almost because they have again, they're very, very sick. They're dying. So that's where some of those words come from. And this is also where we get the word melancholy. And you can see the root cholera here. That means bile. Melon means black. So melancholy today means sad, depressed, but it used to mean black bile. So sorry, talking a lot about bile, which I know is a gross word, but where it does come from this, and that's where that you see this word down here, bilan. That basically means the same thing. All right, let's read a few more of these just for fun. Encumber has its roots in the story of a medieval saint known in England as Uncumber and by several other names in Europe. Startlingly beautiful but deeply pious, pious means overly holy, Uncumber was married off by her parents against her wishes. The night before her wedding, she prayed God would intervene in some way to prevent the marriage so that she could fulfill her dream of becoming a nun. When she woke up, she had a full beard. Her suitor ran a mile, and thus unencumbered, she was able to move to the nunnery and live the rest of her days in blissful, pious peace. So Uncumber was a woman who grew a beard to avoid getting married. I think that's a fantastic way to to get out of getting married to someone you don't know or you don't want to get married to. Here's another one. So Italian diagnosis fail equals etymology win. So some lovely historical misconceptions have been embedded in our medical language. So both malaria, hopefully right away you notice this mal at the beginning meaning bad, and influenza, flow, are vestiges of a time before the contagion and vector-borne theories of disease. At certain points in time, it was noticed that entire communities were stricken with nasty symptoms, coughs, sneezes, chills. Before there was any sense that disease could spread from person to person through a contagion, such periodic outbursts were believed to be the effect of ill-crossed stars. The community was under the influence of a malign astrological constellation. The Italian for influence, influenza. So it basically means in plus flu, which you should know means flow. So basically means to flow in or to flow through. So, I mean, they weren't completely wrong. It did flow through something, but it had nothing to do with ill-crossed stars. And malaria, it's another literal one. Before the vector-borne theory of disease was established and the mosquito identified as the vector for malaria, the only explanation for the high incidence of malaria in swampy regions was the mal, literally bad, plus aria, which means air, given off by the swamp, not the little midges that bred in them. So this is where the word originally came from. So they had it right that it was caused by things living in the swamp, they just didn't have the right bug quite yet. Oh, and consider this a buy two get one free Italian etymology fact. Quarantine. You might remember this one. We did talk about this toward the beginning of the year. So this comes from quar, which you probably recognize as quad, which is 4. Quarantina, giorni, means literally 40 days. And that was the time that ships arriving from plague-ridden areas would be made to dock outside Venice before they could enter the port. And so Europe. Awesome Italian medieval facts. So just for fun, those ones you know. Now we'll do maybe one more, because this one's interesting as well. So why is the thing on your wrist called a watch? In medieval monasteries, time was punctuated by the regular ringing of bells, prayer bells, dinner bells, curfew bells. This signaled time to not only the monks, but also those in the surrounding area. Someone sat in the church steeple, sounding the regular bells, but also keeping a lookout for approaching danger. They would watch them. Night, swarming hordes, etc., which he would signal by ringing an alarm bell. So this man was known as the watch. Or on your grandpa's watch, given that you're probably too young to wear one and have an app for that instead. Okay, so I think that, let's see. Here's something fun to try. So some of these words you should know, some of them you might not know. So the Latin root am means love. So an amiable person would be what? Would they be talkative, truthful, well-educated, or friendly, good-natured? Well, if it means love, probably D, friendly and good-natured, good. So the Latin root plac means to please. So a complacent person, if you remember com or con means with, plac means to please. So someone who pleases with. So basically, is someone who makes frequent mistakes, is argumentative, is self-satisfied, is known to tell frequent lies. So basically, is one who's pleased with himself. So that would be complacent. The Latin root luc, lum, lus means light. In Harry Potter, the spell to make light is lumos, which comes from the same root. So a lucid argument would be very clear and understandable. Literally, it would be full of light, pretty much. It would be something that you could easily understand. That's lucid. Also, there's the idea of lucid dreaming, which is dreams that are clear and understandable and things that you can control, basically. Whereas other dreams are things that we cannot control. The Latin root qui means quiet, so quiescent person, would they be very isolated, very chaotic, very dangerous, very still and restful, and of course it would be very still and restful. Then we have loc, locu, which you should know means word or speech, so something that's eloquent would be expressed in an effective way. So an eloquent person, the noun form would be eloquence. Okay, now the Greek word auto means self, so if you have autonomy, that means that you are, of course, independent. And the Greek root pathos, means feeling, suffering, or disease. So if you have empathy, you literally basically feel toward other people. So you identify with feelings of others. The Greek root pseudo means false, fake. The root nom means name. So a pseudonym would be, of course, a false name. You can also see here synonym, antonym. Those are words that have this root nym in it. The Greek root dog or dox means opinion. The suffix ic means having the quality of. So a person who is dogmatic is basically intolerant of other opinions. They think that their opinion is the only one that matters. I'm sure you guys don't know anyone who's like that. Of course, I'm kidding. Everyone knows people like that. The Greek root phil means love, and the root anthro means human. So philanthropy is, of course, the love of humankind, which you guys already knew. All right, very good. Let's do a little bit more. We have a few minutes left here. I'm going to finish a little early today because I want you guys to have time to do the quiz that I sent in the email as well. So here we have the words moron, imbecile, and idiot mean different things. So in psychology, an idiot has the least intelligence on the IQ scale. This is now the equivalent to someone who is mentally retarded or the more politically correct mentally challenged. An imbecile is not quite as dumb as an idiot and is now considered the equivalent to modern retardation. A moron is the highest level of intelligence for someone who is mentally retarded, just considered being mildly mentally retarded. Specifically, those who have an IQ between 0 and 25 are idiots. IQs between 26 and 50 are considered imbeciles, and 51 to 70 are considered morons. These terms were popular in psychology as associated with intelligence on an IQ test until around the 1960s. They then were replaced with the terms mild retardation, moderate retardation, severe retardation, and profound retardation. In addition to this, other factors besides IQ are now used in diagnosing these levels of mental deficiency. So they had different technical definitions. Actually, these were considered to be the medical terms, and then people started using them as insults, and now we don't use them in medical circles anymore. In addition, same with the word retarded. Retarded is not a bad word. It literally means, it comes from re, which means back, okay, of course, plus tard, which means to go. So if someone, or to hold rather. So if someone is retarded, it is literally like they're held back. It is something that's keeping them from moving forward. And that's why mentally challenged is a good substitute for that, because it essentially means the same thing. If you're mentally challenged, then you are held back from it when compared to other people, basically. So while we would never call someone retarded anymore, it's a very rude word to say nowadays, it did not have that connotation when it was first invented. It was just a medical term, like moron, imbecile, and idiot were also medical terms. So those are definitely things that unfortunately people have misused throughout history, and therefore they're not things that we say anymore to other people without it being an insult. So here we have another one. Why pencil lead is called lead. So pencil cores are called lead even though they don't contain lead. They're made of graphite powder with clay mixed in as a kind of a binding agent to keep it together. In the 16th century, a large deposit of pure solid graphite was discovered in Borrowdale, England. This is the first time in recorded history that high-quality solid graphite had been found. When metallurgists first encountered the substance, they thought it was some sort of black lead rather than a form of carbon. Thus they called it plumbago, which is derived from plumbum, which is a Latin for lead. It didn't take people long to realize that solid sticks of high-quality graphite were good for marking things. At that point, the newly discovered substance from the mines of Borrowdale became extremely valuable, so much so that guards were eventually posted at the entrance to the mine and laws were passed to stop people from stealing the solid graphite. In addition, once a sufficient stock of the graphite was mined, the mine itself would be flooded until more graphite was needed. Unfortunately, sticks of pure graphite are fairly brittle, so people started embedding it in various things, such as hollowed out pieces of wood, and also simply wrapped tightly in sheepskin. Thus, the pencil was officially born with a core of solid graphite, which is known as black lead. The tradition of calling sticks of graphite lead has endured to this day. And then last in here, the words Crayola and crayon come from. So it was originally thought up by Alice Biney, a one-time school teacher, combined the French word cray, meaning chalk, with ola, shortened from the French word oleagineux, meaning oily. Oleagineux derives from the Latin oleaginous, which is the adjective form of olea, meaning more or less olive tree. So the French crayi comes from the Latin creta, which means chalk, and addition can mean clay. So crayi is also where the crayon gets its leading cray, though the word crayon existed long before Crayola crayons were invented. It first appeared around the 16th century in the French language and meant chalk pencil, and later just shortened to pencil, as it still means today. Hence, given the origin of the words, Crayola crayon more or less just means oily chalk pencil, which is pretty accurate. If you look at a crayon, it has that oily substance on it. It actually pretty much is just an oily chalk pencil. A couple more just for fun. So the word man was originally a gender-neutral word. So the word man was originally gender neutral, meaning more or less the same as the modern day word person. It wasn't until about 1,000 years ago that the word man started to refer to a male, and it wasn't until the late 20th century that it was almost exclusively used to refer to males. Before man meant a male, the word were or woman was commonly used to refer to male human. This word almost completely died out around the 1300s, but survived somewhere in words like werewolf, which literally means man-wolf. Women at the time were referred to as wif or wifmen, meaning female human. The latter wifmen eventually evolved into the word woman, but retained its original meaning. And the word wif eventually evolved into wife, with its meaning obviously being changed slightly. Interestingly, the word men, meaning to think or to have a cognitive mind, was also gender neutral and connected to man, which meant the thinker. So we can see how man was originally referred to as all humans. So a man was originally referred to as a man. A person was originally referred to as a man because we are the thinkers of the world. In other words, we are the mammal, I guess, if you want to say that, who thinks the most or thinks the most critically, and we think uniquely apart from types of other animals. So therefore we were called men. And then of course men, I'm talking about males, decided that they didn't necessarily want to share that with women, and so they changed it over time, of course, to just refer to males and not females. So how did the word spam mean junk message? So in your email box, you usually have a spam folder, and that is where your junk mail goes. So while some have suggested that this is because spam, as in the meat product that they eat in Hawaii and other places, is sometimes satirized as fake meat, thus spam messages are fake messages, this potential origin, while plausible enough on the surface, turns out to be not correct at all. The real origin of the terms comes from a 1970 Monty Python's Flying Circus skit. Monty Python was a comedy group. In this skit, all the restaurant's menu items devolve into spam. When the waitress repeats the word spam, a group of Vikings in the corner sing spam, 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 lovely spam, wonderful spam, drowning out other conversation until they are finally told to shut it. Exactly where this first translated to internet messages of varying types, such as chat messages, news groups, etc., isn't entirely known, as it sort of happened all over the place in a very short span, no pun there, of years, in terms of the name being applied to these messages. It is, however, well documented that the users in each of these first instances chose the word spam, referring to the 1970 Monty Python sketch where spam singing was drowned out conversation and spam itself was unwanted and popping up all over the menu. That's where it originally comes from there. Let's see. So we have, sorry, I didn't realize this repeated. You can kind of ignore that. So we have a few more here if you guys want to go over this as well. These are different words that you may or may not know. At the very end, we also have different phrases and where they come from. So Achilles heel, which you probably are familiar with if you're familiar with mythology. We also have the mandragora plant, one of the first known anesthetics. So we'll talk about this one briefly because I think this one's very interesting. So the mandragora plant, we call it the mandrake root, has a long taproot that is usually bifid. Bifid, hopefully you know what this word comes from. Bi meaning two, fid which means root, so two roots. Has a rough resemblance to that of a human form. Go ahead and Google mandrake or mandragora plant and you'll see that it looks like a little human basically. The anthropological shape evidently was responsible for the superstition that it shrieked when it was uprooted and that its scream brought about the death of any who heard it, or if it didn't actually kill them, it caused them to go insane. Because of the fear of death or insanity from pulling mandragora from the ground, the root was merely loosened by the collector, and he or she attached a cord to the collar of his or her dog. With the dog's struggle to get away, the root was freed from the earth. An old document declares, "Therefore they did tie some dog or other living beast into the roots thereof with a cord, and in the meantime stopped their own ears for fear of the terrible shriek and cry of the mandrake, in which cry it doth not only die itself, but the fear thereof killeth the dog." So they're saying basically that Well, the dog will probably die as well, but at least it's the dog and not you who's dying by uprooting the mandrake. So this is where the idea that the mandrake was their scream would kill any living animal nearby came from. So mandragora was the most popular anesthetic. Anesthetic, of course, if you're familiar, is what causes you to be numb during a surgery, things like that. It was the most popular anesthetic during the Middle Ages, and in the Elizabethan age, it was still being used as a narcotic. Medieval physicians analyzed symptoms, examined excreta, and made their diagnoses. Then they would prescribe diet, sleep, rest, exercise, or baths. They could also administer emetics and purgatives or bleed the patient. Surgeons could treat fractures and dislocations, repair hernias, and perform amputations and several other operations. Some of them prescribed opium, mandragora, or alcohol to deaden the pain. Childbirth was led to midwives who relied on folklore and tradition. So the mandrake has long been known for its poisonous properties. In ancient times, it was used as a narcotic. A narcotic is a drug and an aphrodisiac, and it was also believed to have certain magical powers. Its forked root, its bifid, if you will, seemingly resembling the human form, was thought to be powered by dark earth spirits. It was believed that the mandrake could be safely uprooted only in the moonlight after appropriate prayer and ritual by a black dog attached to the plant by a cord. Human hands were not to come in contact with the plant. In medieval times, people commonly believed the mandrake was pulled from the ground. It uttered a shriek that killed or drove mad, etc. So it goes back all the way to AD 40 through 90, so it's an ancient thing. And if you're familiar again with Harry Potter, it did come up in those stories where they had to wear the earmuffs when they pulled the mandrake root out of the ground. All right. So the rest of this is just for your own, I guess, information, interesting facts here. We have everything from where the arena came from to the calendar. You'll find out where the word dinosaur came up. Lots of interesting stuff here that you guys are welcome to peruse through. Other than that, again, this is our last class. So I wanted to leave you guys with a little challenge in order to help you with your education from here on out with vocabulary. Vocabulary really is very important. It opens your world. It gives you the power to be able to express yourself more clearly. The bigger your vocabulary, the less you have to fish for the right word to say. You're able to immediately draw it up in your mind, and you're able to express yourself very eloquently. Whereas if you don't have a good vocabulary, you tend to either say too much or ramble on without getting to the point, and you just don't seem quite as put together and intelligent as those people who do have a good vocabulary. And in addition, it also just makes reading more fun too. The better your vocabulary, the more you're able to read and understand and comprehend. So I would challenge you over the summer, don't completely just stop reading, stop doing anything that's going to help your education. Read things that challenge you. If you need anything at all, I always have lots of recommendations for things to read, and I would recommend that you do all that you can to help yourself out. All right, it's been a true joy to have you guys in class this semester. I hope you have a really, really great summer. If you have any questions at all, or if you need any help or any guidance in your own self-education, please don't hesitate to email me or give me a text or something like that, and I'll be more than happy to help you guys out. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys soon. Bye-bye.